Hi, my name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, and I'm engaged in a research project where I'm interviewing intelligence professionals and researchers who are writing about intelligence reform in a way that challenges the conventional wisdom, with the hope that this discussion can lead to more comprehensive reform of the intelligence policy and national security policy in the United States. And today I'm with Dr. Erik Dahl. He's a professor here at the Naval Postgraduate School, Department of National Security Affairs, and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. He was a naval intelligence officer for 21 years and then obtained a PhD from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He is the author of last year's Intelligence and Surprise Attack, Failure and Success from Pearl Harbor to 9/11 and Beyond. Dr. Dahl, you served in and have studied the intelligence community for almost 3 decades, a little more than 3 decades.
That's right.
It's a $70 billion a year enterprise, 5 million cleared employees and staffs. I tend to think of it more as an enterprise than just a community anymore. But what is the mission of this intelligence enterprise?
Well, it's a good way to put it. An intelligence enterprise, certainly more than any single intelligence community, which is what we usually talk about, but still the fundamental, the main, the central part of the American intelligence enterprise, as you put it, was established after World War II to prevent what we called strategic surprise, to really try to, bottom line, prevent another Pearl Harbor type surprise, devastating attack on the United States. The intelligence community and intelligence agencies have always had a lot more to do during the Cold War, keeping track of current events, of world events, keeping our military prepared. But that was the main goal. And the question since 9/11 has been whether or not that still is sufficient for a single primary goal. Is it enough to try to keep America safe from a single devastating attack? Or are we today, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about this, are we today expecting our intelligence community to keep individual Americans safe, not just America safe, but all Americans safe? And how do we do that?
And despite the effort and the expense that we put into this effort, intelligence often fails. And in your book, you mentioned 2 spectacular failures, Pearl Harbor and 9/11. But based on your studies of surprise attacks like this, and you focused on that surprise attack, what's the conventional wisdom regarding why intelligence fails?
Well, the subject of intelligence failure is probably the most studied question in the intelligence studies literature. And in fact, there is, as you say, there's a conventional wisdom. There's a standard understanding about why intelligence fails and how intelligence fails. And it really was first established back in the one of the most famous books after Pearl Harbor by Roberta Wallstetter. And she termed it that we weren't able to find the important warning signals in the middle of all the noise of other things going on. We had a similar finding after the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 Commission had a different image, but kind of a similar concept. They said that the information was there, but we couldn't connect the dots. So what this really means in intelligence terminology is that we find that intelligence analysis fails. At least that's the standard understanding about intelligence failure, that usually the warning signs were there, but we couldn't understand it. We perhaps weren't imaginative enough to understand it. At least that's the conventional wisdom.
Dr. Dahl, for your study, you adopted a methodology that's fundamental to social science, the use of a control group. But this actually hasn't been used in a lot of failures or studies of intelligence failures. You compared well-known intelligence failures like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 to cases where the surprise was actually thwarted or stopped. What did you learn from studying it that way?
Well, it's fascinating that most of what we know about intelligence, and especially about how intelligence works, comes from intelligence failures when things don't go right. What I wanted to do was find out what happens when intelligence works, when intelligence succeeds in preventing a surprise attack or preventing a terrorist attack. And what I expected to find was that I would find that conventional wisdom would be borne out. In other words, I would find that when intelligence works, it's because intelligence analysts connect the dots. They sort of put together widely scattered bits of information. They come up with a theory, a hypothesis, bring it to a decision maker, and the decision maker says, you're brilliant, you're imaginative, let's go stop something bad from happening. But I found that's not what happens. In fact, there are many cases of brilliant analysis, connecting the dots, that didn't do any good. What does seem to work is when intelligence collectors, not analysts, but collectors, it's actually the harder job of finding the intelligence in the first place. When collectors can find very specific, precise information, what in a military sense we call tactical or operational intelligence. And then they need to take it to a decision maker, a policy maker, a leader who is receptive, who understands intelligence and is willing to listen. And often, in fact, that second part is the hardest part of the intelligence business.
And that's what I found fascinating reading your book, that it's often the intelligence or the intelligence that gives sound warning, and the policymaker fails to heed that accurate warning. What causes that policymaker not to heed the warning?
Well, many intelligence experts and insiders, and also many academic scholars of intelligence, have argued that the main reason for intelligence failure, the main reason why our assessments aren't used, is because policymakers don't listen. And I didn't find that's exactly the case. What I found was that policymakers think they want long-range, big-picture strategic intelligence. They want somebody to connect the dots and come up with a brilliant assessment. But that's not what convinces them. Decision makers, whether they're military, governmental, civilian, decision makers, I found, don't want to make a difficult, dangerous decision based on a hunch, on an assessment, on somebody just connecting the dots. They want to know specifically what the nature of the problem is and what specifically I need to do in order to solve it. That's what makes them receptive to intelligence.
And of course, one of the successful surprise attacks that you studied were the 9/11 attacks. And you document really an incredible amount of advance warning going back for several years. And that's one particularly strong aspect of the book I found, where it's all in a very concise way, one after another. It's really quite compelling, and even more astonishing how the policy makers didn't adapt to these increasing warnings. Why do you think the conventional wisdom that this was a failure of imagination is wrong?
Well, it is amazing, and I tried to put together, as you say in my book, all of the different warnings that we had before 9/11. And it's amazing, and on the one hand you might think, how is it possible that our nation's leaders didn't understand these warnings? But then I realized that almost all of those warnings were of this sort of broad, general, non-specific nature, what we call strategic warning. And usually our experts think we need strategic warning, but our decision makers didn't want to listen to it. In fact, there's one case where the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they have their own intelligence organization, and their intelligence analysts put together the dots. They assessed that there was a real significant threat to terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda, perhaps, using airplanes as bombs. But they didn't have any specific facts to back it up. You would still think that the FAA, that organization within our government, would be the most willing to listen to warnings like that. But even the FAA leadership wasn't willing to do anything about that when all it was analysis. They hadn't been able to get inside the Al-Qaeda plot and give specific warning. So it's not that strategic warning that's really needed. What instead we need is even better collection, which is tougher on a specific threat, and that's what we didn't have before 9/11.
Could it also be that the amount of warning, the repetitiveness of the warning actually dulled its effect?
We do see that happen fairly often. In other studies of intelligence failure, such as the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, there were lots of warnings, dozens of warnings, in fact, of the possibility of car bombs, for instance, against our facility there. And they did dull the warning. In fact, the Marine leadership said afterward that, hey, we didn't need anybody else telling us to watch out. We were watching out as much as we could. What we didn't have in that case was we didn't know who to watch for. We didn't know what kind of specific threat to have happen. And that's what also happened before 9/11. So again, I think we talk about connecting the dots, that we like to think, that's what the 9/11 Commission said, we need to connect the dots better. I think we need to collect the dots much more specifically. We need much more fine-grained intelligence if we're going to use that intelligence to stop bad things from happening.
And when you say fine-grained, do you mean focusing the intelligence effort?
I do. In fact, that gets into a topic that often people talk about today, sort of big data, collection of large data sets. And what I found is it's not big data that prevents bad things from happening. It's little data. It's really fine-grained intelligence. In fact, you usually need, for a terrorist plot, you need someone inside that plot. You need to actually know what precisely a decision maker can do to prevent that.
And one of the concerns I've raised about big data is that the more data, the more alarms get set. Maybe lower level alarms, but more alarms. And in your discussion of the 9/11 attacks was the possibility of false alarms, the fact that so many of these hair-raising incidents didn't actually come to fruition. I remember in the FBI in 1999, in the run-up to the millennium, there was all sorts of concerns, and you document in the book that all sorts of groups were going to take advantage of the dawn of the new millennium to have attacks. And then when there weren't any, the next warning was maybe a little less likely to be heeded. Is that a possibility?
Well, that's certainly something that we see in intelligence all the time. And in fact, that's one of the important ways that intelligence for domestic purposes, homeland security issues, is different from national security intelligence, in the sense that to some extent, when you're focusing your intelligence assets outward toward the rest of the world, toward outward enemies, false alarms, false positives don't matter quite as much, because we're on alert anyway, and a sort of wrong report about a potential foreign enemy that doesn't come to fruition may not be that dangerous, that bad. But when that false report is about a domestic person, domestic organization, not only do you risk overwarning your decision makers, who then become numb to those warnings, but possibly you've blamed or you've accused an American citizen of doing something that they weren't trying to do. So it's a double problem domestically.
You also, for the book, compiled a database of successfully thwarted or prevented terrorist attacks. What did you learn from studying those incidents?
I found really two major points. One is that I believe that the nature of the domestic terrorism threat in the United States today is actually more serious, more severe than many believe it is, especially when we consider that there are a number of plots that have been thwarted since 9/11 from domestic right-wing or other sorts of organizations. It's certainly not just international terrorist groups, it's certainly not just Muslim groups. That's the nature of the threat.
Right.
But then the most important question I thought that we need to look at is, how are these threats thwarted? How do we stop these things from happening? And here I found that for the most part, the tools and techniques that are used to stop these would-be terrorists are usually the very similar, the same tools and techniques that law enforcement has been using for many years. It's tips from the public, it's undercover officers, it's the use of informants. It's not so much, when we're talking domestically, homeland security threats, it's not so much the national intelligence assets such as spies overseas or satellites or even signals intelligence efforts.
And so over the course of the last year, there were some intelligence leaks that I think many Americans were shocked about the scope of the domestic electronic surveillance that's going on. What did you find about the role of that type of electronic surveillance in stopping terrorist attacks?
I think that what we're finding is that the domestic plots that have been foiled, I found over 100 domestic terrorism plots that have been prevented since 9/11, at least from what I can tell and from what we've seen from a number of the official studies into the National Security Agency programs, for instance. We aren't finding that it's that sort of program that stops domestic plots and homeland security plots. Those sorts of programs may certainly be effective overseas. We don't have the information on that. But domestically, it's mostly this much sort of lower level, much more of a law enforcement approach that seems to be effective.